Hello, Colectivo de Impacto community. I'm really happy to find you all again here. We are on our third episode of Wednesday Talk, and we are really happy that we are conversing today with Ward Mailliard. To begin with our conversation, in which we will present you the three main insights that we have been developing in our conversing around education, I wanted to begin with a reflection from Humberto Maturana and Ximena Dávila that will set up the space for all of us to reflect about education. And the quote and the reflection goes like this: listening demands respect. Without respect, we can never listen to one another because our judgment interferes. Listening to others requires confidence in oneself. Only thus can one not be afraid of disappearing in hearing what is said, and there is no risk in hearing it. Listening requires acceptance of oneself, a willingness to know that which one does not know. That which we listen offers us an opportunity to learn and not be competing. So it is in that same spirit that I invite you all to listen to what our good friend Dennis has to say to us. Hello, Dennis. How are you doing?
Good, Sebe. How are you?
Pretty well.
So the times that we're living in around the world right now are showing us that there's significant social disruption. And we're not able to be physically together. So what we used to take for granted, our social nature, being together every day, hugging each other, going shopping with each other, playing sports with each other, is no longer available to us. And our young people, our children, our grandchildren, our young friends are being impacted as well as the adults. The adults are dealing with this disruption in one particular way, and students are dealing with it in quite a different way. So I'm delighted that Ward is here with us today. I wanted to start with reflections from the former superintendent of Creswell School District here in Oregon. He and I are friends, and I invited him to join me in the school cafeteria, in the kitchen, in just observing cooks, just listening to cooks to discover how they do what they do when they cook. So I'd like to read what he wrote about that. He titled this, "What was created as a result of a day in the kitchen?" As superintendent of the schools, the hardest thing in the world to obtain from people in the organization is accurate information. The natural tendency for people is to tell you what they think you want to hear, not what you need to hear. A simple illustration for me is the subject of title. For example, I want to be called Jim, but they insist on calling me Dr. Ford. To the cooks of our district, I'm Jim. After spending a day walking in their shoes, I can count on them to treat me like a cook, and cooks tell it like it is. During my day with them, I shared the pressure of the just-in-time daily deadline and the joy of completing the project, the meal. I discovered too that they knew more math than I did, could think on their feet, collaborate on a dime, self-start, and bring joy to their work. When I was with them, I could too. As a result of the visit, 3 of their ideas are built into our district improvement plan, and they will be assisting the teachers in the district with mathematics instruction and numeration, estimation, probability, and statistics. You see, there's a whole lot of math going on every day in the kitchen. Furthermore, the superintendent, technology coordinator, learning leader, and business manager will be working one day this school year in the following job categories: secretary, cook, custodian, classroom aide, and transportation. The staff development, working others' jobs, for Creswell School District leaders will maximize our commitment to creating boundaryless, fluid structures and keeping an eye on how our workplace organizes its relationships. Are we having fun yet? Oh, yes. We want to be a school district, not a district of school, and nothing has moved us further in this direction more quickly than what we learned from the cooks. I really love those reflections. So it's my pleasure to introduce Ward Mailliard. We got together about a year ago. Ward is a co-founder of the Mount Madonna Education Center and a person I love to listen to reflect on education, learning, and our relationships with our children. So Ward, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you, Dennis. And it's an honor to be here, especially in this network of networks of conversation, because the people who are present each have their own networks of conversation that they're in. And I want to reflect on what you just said and tie us into last week. Because last week, the wonderful conversation that took place, one of the notes I took is, when positional power is absent, information becomes more accurate, which I think was the superintendent's experience of placing himself in a conversation that led to honesty. And solutions appear in shared understanding. So as our understanding changes, our behavior changes. And it sounds like he went through quite an enormous transitional experience by being present in a conversation where honesty took place. So this leads me back to, I guess, the beginning of a transformation with a simple quote from Humberto Maturana, who has been perhaps one of my greatest mentors, even though he may not realize that. When he said in regards to education, a child does not learn math, they learn living together with a math teacher. And every time I have ever used that line in working with educators, there's always kind of a knowing chuckle that comes out, as there's an innate knowing I think the teachers have, that it's the living together with the students that produces whatever gets produced in the classroom. And that connects to one of the deeper thoughts from Humberto, which has to do with the basic concept that what we conserve as a species in our manner of living with our children and pass on consequently to the children determines the direction of the evolution of our humanness. And so as we look at schools, there are these questions that occur, which is, what am I as a teacher conserving in my manner of living with my students? Am I conserving intimacy, trust, and cooperation, which we know neurobiologically makes people smarter and lets the brain function as it can function? Or dominance and submission, which we know actually attenuates the possibility of response. So there's a power dynamic that takes place. And when we go to positional power, we have the teacher and we have the students, going back to your quote, Dennis, that you read. So what are we conserving, or do we want to conserve in relationship of living with our students, with the eye towards understanding that a student is involved in the learning experience for anywhere from 6 to 18 years of their life? That becomes a conditioning ground for that human being. And if they are learning about power as dominance and submission rather than as intimacy, trust, and cooperation as you facilitate learning, that's going to produce a different kind of human being. So that takes me to point number 2, which is something that has occurred to me along the way, that we have both the explicit curriculum, which is the content of what we teach, which is important for organizing young human beings to participate in a lifetime experience in the world. But more importantly these days, I think about the implicit curriculum. And the implicit curriculum, as I would define it, is constituted by the processes by which we teach, and then I would say in specific language, the resultant relationships from that come from those processes. So if the processes are engaged with getting the right answer, pleasing the teacher, trying to absorb more information than a human being can absorb and repeat it back in a certain way in order to get the response and move on and get the grades that you need to go on to college and participate in the system, that is one dynamic, which then the relationships become competitive, positional, and there's a loss of curiosity and empathy and collaboration in the classroom. And what you hear in education today is the need for collaboration, for good critical thinking, for creativity, for honesty. Well, the processes that we use will produce the student's relationship to some extent with all of those things. Am I going to collaborate with my peers? Am I going to compete with them? Am I going to seek my own advantage at the expense of others? That my A will depend on Dennis's C? What kind of human being does that produce? And I'm convinced that there may have something to do with what I would call entitlement and greed, where I've gone through this experience, I've sacrificed some of my humanness, and I deserve what I get. And if you didn't do that, you don't deserve what you get. Therefore, the inequity that in the system is justified. So the question then leads me to the third point, which is how do we conserve the networks of conversation in which our young people will feel loved, listened to, and cared for, and to create the relational space in which there's empathy and concern for other. And I would add for our environment, because understanding the interconnectedness of all human beings is a fundamental principle that needs to be understood by us in order to have an adequate civil society. So when I look at what are the processes by which the human beings that we wish to emerge from our schools one day will emerge, then we have to consider the nature of the conversation that's happening in the classroom, which is based on the relational field of what the teacher conserves in living with their students. So there's a quote I want to read from Humberto, and then we can move into the next phase of this. The history of human beingness is carried by children, not by adults. Even though adults make the present through their living, children learn to be whatever they become by living with others. They become the adults of one kind or another according to how the adults with which they live. And it is for these reasons that we claim that the upbringing of a child takes place as a transformation in coexistence, and that human loving humanness will be conserved or lost through the upbringing of the children. And since the majority of their time is spent in this process of education or schooling, we need to attend to the living together with our students that deals not just with their learning of information, but their psyche, which is the emotional reasoning space that every human being lives in. I want to tag on to what Sebastián said at the end, because it's something that I hope that we hold in mind when we're in conversation. And this again comes from an article by Humberto and Ximena. Listening consists of hearing and attending to what we hear, and in which what the other says is valid. There are two ways of listening. In one, we attend to what we hear to the extent that what the other says coincides with what we think. And so in effect, we're only listening to ourselves. The other is attending to what we hear when what the other says is valid. If one does this, one hears what the other says, and the other has presence. That which is social and democratic is based on the second kind of listening, from whence it's possible for loving conduct to arise. And so in the small group, listening with curiosity greater than criticality and asking questions of clarification become the fundament of being in a relationship of listening where the other arises as valid. And Humberto's definition of love, which is recognizing the appearance of the validity of another or the legitimacy of another, to be in loving conversation, in my experience, is transformational. So thank you very much. And Sebastián, back to you.
Thank you very much, Ward. It remains stuck in my mind in your presentation, this reflection about what Humberto mentioned, about the history and how kids are raised. What that brings me is to distinguish also that education is part of our daily living. It happens at any time, at any moment, and at every stage of our living. So if we understand that education is the process by which we transform each other in living together, these main insights that you share with us also apply to all the different domains in which we realize our living. Asking ourselves, what do I want to conserve in my relationship with, is not only for the educational domain. I think it's a manner to approach the way in which we live together, in which we generate communities, in which we move forward, generating different subcultures where we are. And it's interesting, this distinction about the implicit and explicit curriculum, because that connects us also with the fact that the explicit many times has to do with the bureaucracy we have to fulfill or with cultural expectations and demands. But this implicit curriculum, unfortunately, that is implicit, is the way in which we relate to each other, is the way in which we live together in a day-to-day basis. So my question would be, how is it that we left the quality of our relationship into an implicit domain? So
this is such a good question, Sebastián. Do you have an answer?
I think that question, the value of it is not the answer, but the fact that we as human beings, all of us, in this situation of coronavirus, in this situation of climate emergency, in this situation of poor education in many places, is a question that we should ponder, maybe even tattoo in our forehead, because I think that this is a question to inhabit that will allow us to make the drift and transformation that human living is crying to happen,
Can I add one thought to that?
And even two, if you wish.
Thank you. What I would add to that is I think that Humberto's work and the work of all of the people involved with him, Matriztica and everything, is making the implicit explicit. And I think maybe the answer is, can we make the implicit explicit? Because it is in this deeply implicit relationship of emotioning and reasoning together, where the unconscious action that we're taking in the world is bringing about the kind of destruction and inequalities, because we haven't understood what's implicit. So the blessing, I think, of the work that you all do is taking the implicit and making it explicit, taking the background and making it foreground for our understanding. And the second idea is just this, that in our last meeting with George, he was showing essentially a similar dynamic when it came to business, to corporate. You brought it to parents and children. I'm simply dealing in the realm of the education, formal education, but I think you're spot on. Bringing the implicit to becoming explicit and understanding what we're really conserving in our manner of living may be the path forward for us, because each person then will be able to evaluate through this reflection for themselves, and then making conscious rather than unconscious decisions.
Now, this word is fascinating to me because what we can see is two paths. I can be the engineer and the designer of moving from the explicit to the implicit. But when I do that, I maintain a patriarchal position. This is my design.
Yeah.
And so there's no movement at all. Right? We stay stuck where we're stuck because that's what I want. But what's interesting
colonization.
What's interesting in these days is that what we typically live in the background as loving one another, enjoying each other's company, going to a parade, going to the Oregon Country Fair, going to the concert, is in the foreground for all of us. And it's nobody's design. If we had to point to anyone, we'd point to Gaia or Mother Nature. So what's fascinating about what you just said, Ward, is we don't have to worry about moving from the explicit to the implicit, because the implicit is in our daily living. Mm-hmm. It's telling us, oh, I miss that relationship. I wanted to go on a walk with my friend. I can't. I can't see my grandchildren. I have to talk to my son through a window. And what's wonderful about your wisdom, Ward, is that this is what you've prepared your students for, I believe, because of this deep thinking that you have. That, in my view, in your manner of viewing education, now there can be a process that says, now that we're in the implicit, how do we conserve this as a learning process and an educational framework that wants to take us back to something we can't go back to? It's really wonderful work.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I would call this practices for uncertain times, which are emergent, and nobody needs to direct it or organize it or colonize others. We have an emergent moment, which I don't want to romanticize the suffering, but we have to find the opportunity in it. And I think people are doing that.
And you know what I love about that, Ward, is emergence for me is the coming into our consciousness of something that we previously were not conscious of. And what's come into our consciousness is our social nature and the nature of our humanness. Beautiful. And you beautifully intertwine the work of Humberto and Ximena and Matriztica with the daily living that you live with your students. And I get to what you said about the pain and the sadness. And I know that we all give homage to the ones who hear the pain and suffering in the world all the time. But I also get your enthusiasm, if that's probably not the right term, but your optimism that we are now in the space of emergence, where what's come into our consciousness is our need to live together well. It's really quite beautiful.
Wow, and in that sense, thank you very much, Ward and Dennis, for enlightening us and opening up more dimensions of reflection around education. But now I'm thinking about the people that is watching this video at home, reflecting about education and saying like, wow, these are deep insights. I'm really happy about this awareness being expanded. However, how can I bring this expansion of awareness and consciousness into an action that I can take tomorrow? So I think that the invitation that I would like to do here is, how can we bring these three main insights into reflexive questions that allow generating certain behavior or practice from the teachers and people all over that are watching this that would like to act upon these distinctions that we're making. So maybe we could start with the first insight, that it's to do with what do we want to conserve. What do you think that you, Ward, as a teacher, think that could be the manner in which teachers all over the world could bring this into a concrete action?
Oh, you're asking me now. Okay. Well, the practice that I see, rather than entirely focus on the content, is actually to listen to the students as they engage with the content and understand how they would like to engage with the content. This doesn't happen all at once. It takes a long time. I deal with 11th and 12th graders, and it takes a long time to, in a sense, unlearn patterns as well. So this is a ramp. I also think that each teacher, if they reflect simply on what do I want to conserve in my manner of living with the students, that is aimed at humanizing or aimed at promoting the idea of self-confidence, of self-love, of curiosity and empathy. I think each teacher ultimately, in their own context, has to figure that out for themselves. Because one thing I know is that, or I believe, let me put it that way, I'm not sure what I know, but one thing I believe deeply is that all learning is local. It depends on the context. And so a first generation learner or an affluent learner who's a third or fourth or fifth generation learner has a very different context. And so we have to start from where we are. And so the basic fundament of love is where we have to start, regardless of the context, and then think about how that works. So I'm sorry, both the problem and the opportunity in this. I wasn't expecting the question, so I'm doing my best. But one thought is that one thing I've learned is that curiosity is the doorway to empathy. Empathy is a feeling state where we feel what others feel. So if we can be curious about our students, we will move into more of an empathetic field. Compassion is an action step that results in part from empathy. But the thing about compassion, as I've been reflecting on it, is it requires discernment, which means that we have to be able to choose in a particular moment what's appropriate. And this ties in with Humberto's definition of intelligence. And he defines intelligence as a flexible response to context. And so what I'm encouraging for each teacher is to be personally reflective and then to have discernment about the context and to use that discernment then to know how to engage with their students in that context. So I don't have an answer per se, but I have maybe a process or a set of principles that start with love and curiosity and discernment.
Thank you, Ward, because that also connects us that this first main insight, which is to reflect about what do I want to conserve in the relationship with my students, is an exercise for all adults and particularly also teachers to reflect after they listen from their students and from the young people. What is it that they are interested, they are curious, they are wanting to flourish about, is to reflect about what you as a teacher want to conserve in that relationship, by understanding that being a teacher is the role of responsibility of accompanying students in the orientation of how they see, on how they observe the world they live together. And for that, of course, teachers need to be intelligent. They need to be plastic behaviorally in an ever-changing world. Like, for example, now you are challenged by COVID-19, well, that's a whole transformation of the world we live in. And let's see how we can behave and act in the most plastic manner in order to conserve what we want to conserve in that relationship. So thank you. That was beautiful. But now we jump to insight number 2.
You said it better than I did. Thank you.
Well, it's a collaborative exercise. The second main insight is about the implicit and the explicit curriculum. And we know that teachers all over the world are pressured by the different reports they have to give, by the different data they need to send to their Ministry of Education, and all the restrictions that there are. So what can we invite these teachers to realize, or maybe to grasp, in order for them not to get drowned by the explicit curriculum and to be able to give room to the implicit curriculum, which is the actual relationship with the students?
Thank you. You actually answered the question in your last statement. I've worked with teachers in various parts of the world, India, South Africa, and of course the United States. And teachers are bound, I call it being between the hammer and the anvil. The hammer is the love of the parents who want their children to be comfortable, secure, and successful. I also think they want to be able to say what they do in one sentence at a cocktail party, but we'll set that aside. And the system, which is massive and very, very slow to change, and has a measurement system that's not conducive to qualitative experience in teaching. And so what I hear from teachers, I've heard it in India and in rural schools as well as in the elite schools, you know, I have to get through the syllabus. I'm going to be measured by the grades that my students are able to achieve, both by the parents and by the system that I'm part of. And I finally had to concede that I can do nothing about the syllabus and I can do very little about the system as a whole until it decides to change itself. The one thing that we have left is our relationship with our students. That they can't take away from us. And so in the midst of all of the busyness of the things that we have to do to produce the results that society says they want, I think if we attend to our loving relationship with the students in whatever form that might take, that is what we have to work with right now. And if we can back up from there and look at the processes that are conducive or not conducive to creating a loving relationship, not only between us and our students, but between the students themselves, that's probably about what we can do right now, till we have a larger wake up in the larger system about the overwhelming emphasis on content.
Ward, what I love about this is the integrity in your thinking. So let's couple the first and second point, the conservation of our loving relations and the explicit and implicit. What it reveals to me is time.
Mm-hmm.
The orientation to time. The explicit lives in the future based on the past. And the implicit is now.
Yeah.
And so maybe a simple guide, it would be a guide for me, wouldn't be a theoretical disposition on time, but would be an awareness of how am I treating time in my relationship with children?
Yeah.
Am I living in the future in the past, or am I presently available to them in the relational drift that's happening not only between me and the students, but between the students and the students in the community, parents, etc. And I hadn't thought about it this way, Ward, until you explained it. And I think what you've also done is you've crossed the threshold that not many educators cross, and that is moving from a world that's three-dimensional, based on a preoccupation with the physical sciences and consumerism, materialism, materialistic science, to a new psychic space. And I use the word psychic because logicians destroyed the psychic space by restricting it to the physical. And in this new space, you're inviting us to go into a temporal relational dimension that I've always felt Matriztica, Humberto, and Ximena have created for us, almost as a gardener would prepare the soil for the planting. And it may seem too abstract, but I don't think it is. I think it could be as simple as, where do I live now in this moment?
Yeah.
And if I find myself in the future, in the past, and I can't see what's presently happening to the children and the people around me, then the future past will never happen anyway. It's really, really wonderful.
Thank you, Dennis, because that also what you have been reflecting now about, and the recursion and connection between the suggestion for insights 1 and insights 2 give us and generates also the suggestion for insight number 3, which is about how to cultivate and foster the loving relationship and the relationships in which we are seen. And that's being present, like really focusing on experiencing and being present in the present that I'm living. When we are with students or with other young people or with you guys, if we are in this conversation and I'm stuck the whole time watching on my cell phone and I'm not present with you but present with another thing, we lose that quality. You will lose that feeling of being heard by me. So being present in the present moment is the exercise also by which we let appear others. Loving cannot happen in the future or in the past. Loving is letting appear others in the present that we live. And in that sense, I believe that in particular in the field of education, we need now more than ever in our 3.8 million years of history as the human lineage to be present with the elderly, with kids, with people middle-aged. Like, we all really should be present, reflecting on how we're living together and what are the consequences that the living together we've had so far had generated to our present. So thank you very much.
Yeah, that was beautiful, both of you. And I just want to add to that from last week's conversation, where we were talking about the brilliance of how to create community and collaboration in a business segment. One, creating the space for honest conversation where everyone can participate. And one of the notes I took was to allow others to appear by listening to them. So the most important emphasis that I can place on classroom engagement is the ability to listen with curiosity in a way that validates the other. And asking, instead of disagreeing or arguing or judging, is asking questions of clarification. I think if I can do that in my classroom, now other people may have many other ways to do. I know they do. You know, this is just what I've hooked my wagon to, so to speak. But if I can create a context in which my students will listen to one another with curiosity and ask questions of clarification, the classroom is transformed and their experience of each other is transformed. And it creates the kind of safety where they can risk their own thinking, because generally classrooms are not safe for risking your own thinking. There's a right and a wrong answer. And in that case, we have positional power. And then the information that we're getting from the students is not authentic because it's meant to please rather than to communicate.
Wow, thank you very much, Ward, for that, because that also invites me to also invite the people who are watching this video to put on the comments and to share this video, sharing what are the practices and the insights that you in your local context of education have been using or have been given results for you that may help and aid others into also continue enhancing and expanding the well-being by which education can take place. So thank you very much, Ward. I hope that you people could please share with us the way in which you have been doing that. Like, let's make of this a global community by which we can share practices, we can share understanding, and we can share insights that may enable us to live a more loving and special experience in education. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So this is all the time we have for today. Don't miss the other videos that we will be uploading. Thank you very much, Dennis. Thank you very much, Ward. One last final word that you would like to share?
For me?
Yes.
It's just this repetition of curiosity being the doorway to empathy, to be curious about the other in whatever context you find. And instead of going to judgment, asking questions of clarification. That changes my world. Every day I remember it.
Thank you.
It's a gift to be in your company.
Thank you, Ward.
Thank you, Ward.
Dennis?
Just reminded of a thread that runs through this. We heard George last week say that he solved a quality threat to Hewlett-Packard that could have taken down the company by acting and believing that the answer to that threat was inside the company itself. It didn't need anyone external. And I hear this theme again from Ward. And so that manner of letting appear through love for another time generates a tremendous cognitive movement, because our loving is our knowing and our knowing is our loving. And the gift of Ward's sharing today for me is to realize that in the times that we're living now, before we go back to something that perhaps we didn't want in the first place. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you very much, Dennis. And for you people watching us there, look for the love in your communities, look for the love in your networks of conversation, and then come back to us with your comments and ideas for our next Wednesday's talk. Thank you very much. See you next week.